Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today, we're talking about what to focus on in class so that you can get the most out of the experience. Your Law School Toolbox hosts are Allison Monahan, that's me, and Lee Burgess. We're here to demystify the law school and early legal career experience so that you'll be the best law student and lawyer you can be. Together with the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the career-related website Career Dicta, I also run the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review or rating on your favorite listening app. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can always reach us via the contact form on lawschooltoolbox.com, and we would love to hear from you. With that, let's get started.
Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today we are talking about what to focus on in class so you can get the most out of the experience. So first off, Allison, why does class even matter?
Well, I mean, there are a number of reasons. Number one, you're actually paying quite a bit to be there.
Like a lot. Like a lot of money.
It's kind of astonishing if you do the math on this.
I did do the math when I was
I did
in
the
school.
math, and I recall it being between like $150 and $200 a class.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I mean, this was Columbia. It was pricey.
Yeah.
So, you think, what else do I pay $200 an hour for? Mm-hmm. I mean, you should be getting everything you can out of this experience. There's not a whole lot that you can actually pay that for.
Yep.
I mean, also critically, this is also fairly obvious. Your professor is the one grading your exam, and class is where they are helping you understand what they're looking for on that exam. Mm-hmm. So you might want to pay attention to that.
Yeah. And class is actually teaching you how to think like a lawyer, how to read cases, how to talk about the law.
We have a whole episode on the Socratic method you can go and listen to.
But when you're entering law school, you don't know much about the law typically. And class is where you get to dialogue about it and learn about, how the judges do what they do, the history, the policy, like a lot of stuff about the law that even if you just read an outline, you wouldn't know.
Right. And just a lot of the vocabulary as well. How do you use these words? How do you pronounce these words? Sometimes you might be looking at this legal Latin and saying, I'm not really sure how you would pronounce that. But your professor is probably going to say that at some point. If you pay attention, you can pick up on that.
Yeah. Some professors are actually very interesting and have done interesting research or have interesting stories or are able to bring a lot of this stuff to life.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, the law itself, hopefully you find it interesting. You're in law school, so this can be an opportunity to really dive into that interest. Mm-hmm. And also you might get participation points.
Yeah, it might be good for your grades, so you should go.
And I think the ABA requires it. Yeah. So basically, you got to go to class.
Yeah. I mean, the reality is we hope that most of your classes are at least a bit interesting. Not all of them. I mean, I had some professors who were super boring.
Yeah, that happens.
It happens. But a lot of my classes were interesting. And if the professor is teaching on an area of the law that they have practiced or they're passionate about, I think that their passion can be somewhat intoxicating.
Yeah, exactly. A good professor can teach a good class on basically anything.
Yeah.
I mean, that's one of the strategies for picking classes as a 2L or 3L is you just take the classes that the professors you like are teaching, regardless of what the topic area is. And that's how I ended up taking like a European Union law class, which, hey, totally relevant as it turns out to world events. Who knew that this would actually be so incredibly relevant? Right. How do you leave the EU? Is that possible? I'm like, well, I did study that. Well, let me tell you, it's probably going to be ugly.
Yep. Yeah, I loved this con law professor at my school, and I took multiple classes from him just because I thought he was brilliant, and I learned a lot from him, and I thought his classes were engaging. And, I still have retained a lot of information from those classes because he was a great professor.
Yeah, exactly. A good professor is definitely worth their weight in gold, and not all of them will be, but a lot of them will be, hopefully. So, I guess let's back up a little bit. What exactly is the point of class? Like, what should we be paying attention to here?
Well, you do all this reading, hopefully, before class,
right.
The material that they're going to cover. And what you're going to talk about in class is what your professor thinks matters in the case. Some professors always think the same stuff matters in almost every case, but they might look at the plaintiff versus the defendant's argument or the defendant versus the government's arguments. Most professors actually have some sort of conceptual approach to what they're trying to teach from cases. Some professors are very basic. You're almost IRACing the case or briefing the case for them in class. Some professors really want you to extract the rules of law in elements. Some professors are really obsessed with policy, and want you to spend a lot of time looking for the policy. I had a professor who was very obsessed with what each side was arguing. That's what he cared about. And his exam actually reflected that.
Right. And that's the interesting thing. I mean, oftentimes when people do have a strong approach, I mean, they don't just do that in class usually. Right. I mean, typically that carries through onto what they're testing you on, unless they're just completely inconsistent as professors, which again, occasionally that happens. Mm-hmm. But typically someone who does have a very structured approach to class has thought about this and is doing it for some reason and thinks that this is important. And that will probably show up on your exam because they want to test you to see if you have learned these skills that they think are important.
Right. So the professor who was really worried about the parties' arguments, it was a criminal law class and criminal procedure. And his whole point was this law only really matters if the government has an argument based on the law and the defendant has an argument based on the law. So I care that you understand what the law is, but I really care that you understand how the law can be applied and kind of maybe twisted or tweaked to make a good argument for either side. And so that's what he cared about. And his exam reflected that.
Now, I talked to a professor at a conference recently who has sort of a grand theory about how you teach, particularly first-year subjects, with cases. And he says, I leave the basic case analysis of what was the procedural posture and, what was this dissent about to other people, because they do that. And his focus is really on teaching people how to extract the black letter law in a very structured way from a case. And of course, he then expects to see that on the exam.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the other thing that some professors actually talk about is what the black letter law is. I think it depends on the professor. I think the more old school the professor is, the less they're going to spend time presenting this information. They might think that you can extract that yourself.
Right. But I mean, you're probably at least going to touch on that in the dialogue, because you've got to have, the law is kind of what we're basing this discussion around.
Yeah.
So if there's a very detailed discussion, at some point the law is probably going to be mentioned.
Mm-hmm. I think what can be interesting, if a class especially is very organized, oftentimes the cases can be pieced together to kind of tell a legal story. Mm-hmm. So a case may be included in the casebook, not even necessarily for the black letter law, but more about how black letter law is applied, or, a nuance of how it could be applied to this specific fact pattern, and so sometimes what's also interesting to think about, and one of the things that can be kind of sussed out in class, is why was this case included in your casebook, and what's the point of this? Because I'm thinking of torts. In torts, you usually start with negligence. You usually start with all the different duties, right? And you might have a case that lays out a few of these different duties, and the blanket rule. But then the next case is let's apply this duty rule to this fact pattern and push it to a different level. And so as much as it is about the black letter law, sometimes it's not just about that. It's about how the black letter law functions.
Right. And how, you develop that over a series of cases, which is basically what you do in a common law system.
Right.
It's not like one case you read just lays out, well, this is the entire development of the law of negligence and duty from, ancient England or whatever. It's more like, oh, this is the piece we need, and so we're going to talk about that.
And even in a class that's more based in statutes, you are going to still find that the cases, there might not be any question what the black letter law is, because the black letter law is written down. That everybody's got the same copy of the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure. It's about the different ways that that law has been applied and the different precedents that people can call on for how it should be applied to different fact patterns. That's kind of what you're focusing on in class.
Right. And I think the thing about class that can be useful is you're getting these new hypos. So your professor, you may not think of them as hypos because it just seems like examples that they're giving and having people talk about. But really, those are hypos that are pulling or illustrating different pieces of the law that you're learning. And a lot of this comes down to, the kind of gray areas or these areas of ambiguity. And sometimes we talk about factual ambiguity or legal ambiguity. So you might have a conversation in class that says, well, there is a statute that says you cannot drive a vehicle in the park. Okay, that seems straightforward. No vehicles in the park. Got it. And then your professor might start raising all these other issues. Well, what about your toddler? Is your toddler allowed to ride his little fake car in the park? Why or why not? Mm-hmm. And there we're really arguing about what is a vehicle.
Right.
So these are the sort of things that you might think sometimes they drive you crazy and you're like, oh God, again, like just more. But you're learning to think about the law, and these are the type of hypos that are very likely to show up on an exam.
Yeah. And if you're not paying attention, you're going to miss really the meatiest information your professor is giving you about the exam is how they discuss these factual hypos in class.
Yeah, and sometimes I think people can get confused. Either they think class is just really all about the black letter law and that's the only thing they should be paying attention to, or they think there is no black letter law and everything is arguable or everything is ambiguous. Neither one of those is correct. There is some starting point, but then there's also this kind of like blobby gray area around it. And learning to differentiate those things is hopefully one of the things that you're doing in class.
Yep. I think I mentioned this earlier, but some professors will really do a deep dive into policy.
Oh, yeah. Do like torts or things like that.
Crim, the theories behind punishment.
Yeah, true. I just talked to someone the other day who was like, I don't really understand my crim class. Like, all we've done is talked about mens rea. And I was like, well, that's because it actually matters later.
It's true. It's true. And specific intent and
right. Like, there are different
intent.
types of crimes. There are different types of defenses. And you need to understand this pretty thoroughly because ultimately, you're going to have to look at like what type of crime is this, and just being drunk negate that or not. Like, well, okay, that all comes back to what type of intent I need.
Right. And I remember learning specific intent and general intent at the beginning of my crim class, my first semester of law school, just being like, I don't get it. And then when you finish the rest of the semester, and then you're like, oh, I get it now.
Right. Or you sometimes, I think it's easy to gloss over a lot of the stuff in the beginning, like, okay, yeah, whatever. Like, that's interesting. Thanks for sharing.
Right.
But then it comes down to that's the only way you can really understand these different types of crimes and defenses.
Yeah.
So, even if your professor seems like they're just going off on some like, crazy tangent, they're probably doing this for a reason. So you probably want to pay attention.
Also, sometimes policy can really help you understand how the law fits together. I think especially in classes that are in a discussion of codes, so evidence, civil procedure, community property in California. If you understand kind of some of the things that they were trying to do. So, for example, in evidence, when you're thinking about hearsay and the hearsay exceptions, if you're thinking what they're really concerned about is whether or not the evidence can be reliable, that it could be tainted, that it could be false. Then you're like, when you read the exceptions, and you're like, oh, okay, well, if I excitedly utter something, I probably don't have time to come up with a false excited utterance,
Right.
It's like, because it's immediate. You don't have time to falsify that information. And so when you think about the policy behind that, even if you can't 100% remember the rule, you can probably say, wow, if my excited utterance needs to be really reliable and I can't have time to change my story, I bet it has to be immediate.
Right.
I bet I have to be under the stress of the situation. And then all of a sudden you've pretty much got the rule based on the policy.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's also interesting, too, when you realize that, a lot of these legal rules are really choices. So, for example, I happened to see an article today that mentioned defamation law in Australia. And apparently it is very, very, very different because it is based on a different set of policy considerations that they decided were more important than what we have decided is important under the First Amendment in the U.S. That's pretty fascinating.
Yeah.
If your professor starts talking about Australia and you zone out because you're like, oh, Australia, like, what does this have to do with anything? But you're kind of missing the point because we didn't have to make those choices about how defamation law is structured. And, sometimes those are actually currently contested.
Yeah. Yeah. What about ways that they want you to approach legal analysis? Do you think that's something that you can learn from just sitting in class?
Yeah, sometimes your professors even tell you directly. For example, we had to take this class called Legal Methods at Columbia that was kind of a pre-class. And I, to this day, kind of remember the professor telling us, like, oh, every time if you have a statute that shows up on an exam, I want you to quote the statute. I want you to underline this and that. I don't remember the exact details, but he was very, very specific. And he would make people kind of go through this exercise in class. And then somehow when I got this exam, I just totally forgot to do that, and I failed the exam.
Oops.
Oopsie. And, I remember I had to go and talk with him about it. Luckily, it was an ungraded class that we just had to pass, but I was currently failing. And I didn't understand what had happened. So I went and talked to him, and he said, what was the thing we talked about for 3 weeks in this class? And I said, oh, you should write this thing down. He's like, did you do that? I'm like, I assume so. He's like, no, you didn't do that. Oops. Oops. And he's like, and that was surprising. It seemed like you were a person who had, was prepared for class and participating and trying hard. So I was really shocked when I got your exam and had to give you a failing grade. So pay attention to what they tell you.
Yeah. So I think that's a great segue into something else we wanted to talk about, is that our professors are going to typically tell us, what we need to write on the exam, but then you also need to think about what you should be writing down and focusing on in class. So if they lay out something for 3 weeks, I hope you're writing that down.
Yeah, exactly. At some point, I probably should have put a little red star saying, FYI, be sure to do this.
Yep.
And I think a lot of people struggle with what to write down.
For sure.
I definitely, my first semester in one of my classes, sat beside of a transcriber.
Yep.
Boy, that was annoying.
And not effective. We now have studies that we didn't have when we were in law school.
Yeah, not effective and
that show that it's
annoying.
Yeah, that show that it's completely ineffective to transcribe.
She was basically literally like a court reporter. Mm-hmm. And she just typed the entire class. And if she got called on, she had no idea what was going on.
Right.
She hadn't really been following the discussion. She was just trying to transcribe everything. I don't even know what she did with it. I mean, I guess she read it later, which doesn't seem efficient. Mm-hmm. So don't transcribe.
Nope. You also don't want to plan to go back to this class again. So some people record professors, although you should probably ask your professor before you record them.
And some of them will let you.
But that's not a good use of time, because if you're really engaged in the class, now this is unless you need these recordings for some sort of accommodations.
Right.
That's separate. But for most students, if you are engaged in class and you are paying attention and you are interacting with the material and you are taking good handwritten notes, you don't need to rewatch it. You're going to have learned enough to keep moving forward. And who has the time to basically take law school twice? I didn't have time to do law school twice.
Nobody has time for that.
No.
I mean, absent some very specific circumstances.
Yeah. And so this is kind of one of the things I think we have tried to incorporate in our Start Law School Right programming, especially for people who are getting ready to start the law school process, is really to practice what you're looking for in these lectures to write down. So a few of the things that you want to try and include in your notes are definitely the black letter law. That's important.
If you're lucky enough to get that,
if you're lucky
definitely
enough to
write it down.
Case basics, especially if you didn't do a written brief. But no matter, even if you had a written brief, you want to know what your professor thought was important about the case.
But for me on this one, for example, I did book briefing, and part of the reason I was comfortable doing that is the cases we discuss in class, I can just write down things like the title, the date, the jurisdiction, and maybe a brief description of the facts while we're doing the discussion.
Right.
Yeah. So, if you haven't gotten that sort of information, I think it's totally valid just to put it in your notes right then, so you can always easily cross-reference it. I always put page numbers too.
Yeah.
What page something was on in case I wanted to go back and look at the book, just to try to make it more streamlined when I was ready to look at these notes, which hopefully you're going to look at them for some reason, to kind of think in advance about, what would make it easier if I need to go back to this.
Yeah. You also want to make sure you're writing down what your professor's, pet topics are.
Yeah.
Because
I think we have a blog post on this one too. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure which site it's on. We'll find it. And it was actually really insightful. She said, I think it's a law professor. And she said when she was in school, she had professor says. And she would use a specific color for that. I think she was handwriting her notes. And so she might draw an arrow so that when she was going back over this material, if her professor had basically expressed an opinion on policy or had expressed some specific opinion about how to do an analysis, she could easily pull that out and make sure that she was really focusing on that when she was preparing for her test. And I thought that was super smart.
That is super smart. I think more and more professors are using PowerPoints and stuff too. And it's probably important to know what they're including in those PowerPoints.
Yeah, exactly.
If they're not giving you copies of those PowerPoints, you want to note, if they're making a big deal about something in that PowerPoint, you should write that down.
Right, exactly. If they bothered bullet pointing it, you probably want to do the same thing.
We've already kind of mentioned this, but that you want to track hypos and fact patterns, because you can even take those and practice writing out practice answers with your study group or on your own. You can even write out an answer and take it to office hours, but you want to be writing down these hypos so you can go back and practice the legal analysis.
Right, and kind of think about for yourself, what was the vehicle in this scenario? What other things might I think of? Okay, well, they gave the example of the toddler on the bike. What about a policeman on a horse? You know,
Right.
you can kind of start thinking for yourself about these questions that clearly a professor thought were sort of important.
Yep. And then, you know, we talked about things like policy and stuff that your professor cares about. You know, oftentimes they'll discuss pro-con lists for policy questions. I even remember vividly my notes having a table, you know, a pro-con for, you know, it was like, especially around property law. It was always like first in time was one of them, I think.
First in time, first in right.
First in right.
Something like that.
The fox. There was like
Yeah,
fox.
the fox. I remember foxes. Something about sticks.
It's been a while since we've been in property, so we're allowed to.
I vividly remember my first property class and kind of sitting there going like, some sticks, some foxes. What is this class about? Like hunting the fox. Okay, this is really getting kind of antiquated.
Yeah, exactly. But the thing you can leave out of your notes is random stuff that students are going to bring up that the professor just dismisses or doesn't dive into.
Yeah, I mean, these people don't know what they're talking about. Don't bother writing like half a page on somebody who's like, well, in my time on the Hill, we talked about this. It's like, okay, you can kind of zone out and, you know, work on your other note taking. One thing on notes too, I think you mentioned earlier, sometimes people who do for accommodations reasons maybe need to record and maybe rewatch a class. Another thing that people may not be aware of as an accommodation is you may be able to get notes from someone else in that class.
That's true. I was a note taker.
Yeah. So basically they get, you know, smarty pantses like Lee who are busy making charts of pro-con policy arguments in their notes. And you can get those amazing class notes.
Yeah.
Sometimes just basically by asking for them with a valid reason.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, even if I hear one of the things that people say of why they are worried not to transcribe the lecture is that they're like, what if I missed something? Well, hey, you could sit down with a friend and compare notes. You could trade notes. You could, you know, maybe make your study group going through the class notes. Like, what did you guys include? And that will allow you to catch anything that you might have missed. That's not a justification for being a court reporter in class.
No, because it's just also, if you're recording things, you're not really filtering, okay, 20% of this is really mission critical, and then 80% of this is kind of like, oh, we're talking about the procedural posture of some random case that is completely and totally irrelevant, actually, to your final exam.
And thoughtful notes, they just are so much more meaningful, and you just have to write stuff down or you will not retain it.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think it's really worth devoting some time to thinking about how to actually record these notes. You know, more and more we see handwriting is probably really the way to go, even though it might almost certainly would put you in the minority in your class. There's a lot of work now showing that handwriting notes is going to help your retention, is going to help your understanding, and it's just different.
Yeah. And so if you're not even sure where to start, you can explore, you know, different methods. There's the Cornell method. You want to share a bit more about the Cornell method?
Cornell.
Yes, the Cornell method.
Yes, Cornell after the university, I think.
I don't know what I ended up trying to say. I was trying to say Cornell. It just wasn't quite coming out right.
Yeah, so the Cornell method is basically, and you can even get pre-printed pieces of paper from our favorite Circa notebooks that are designed for this method. And so basically you have a column down the side, you have an area in the middle that's where you write the bulk of your notes, and then I think you have a piece at the bottom. And, you know, I don't remember the exact details of it, but basically one of the pieces is sort of key points, you know, really key stuff. I think you put in the sidebar, and then you take your normal notes in the middle, and then I think at the end you kind of summarize and ask additional questions and things like that at the bottom. So the point is it's a structured method that you can use for any class, and it's going to keep that information basically in a way that you can use it. I mean, the one thing you need to do with handwritten notes is you probably want to scan them in case you lose them.
True.
You could also consider writing on a tablet or something like that these days. That could work. But I think, you know, if you do want to handwrite, that can be a really effective way. And you can get these notebooks they can let you move pages around and things like that. So, but even if you do use a computer, you know, you want to sort of think the same way. Like, how am I going to structure these? How am I going to make them searchable for later? You know, are you going to highlight things? Are you going to use certain font colors? how are you, because you don't want to just do a brain dump, just like you don't want to do on an exam. You want to have some structured way that you're writing this stuff down and picking out what's important.
Oh, I just had this great idea of using Evernote, which allows you to take pictures of documents and like organize them.
Yeah.
And like taking my handwritten notes and like using labels with Evernote and then having things be very searchable and easy to access when I did my outlines.
Yeah, I think that's the only downside really of using handwriting is that you have to then think about how you're going to access it.
Yeah.
One thing I do not recommend that people love to try to do is they take handwritten notes and then they retype them.
No, that's just such not a good use of time. There is no evidence to show that retyping is a way of learning material.
No, it's like don't retype your notes. Take those notes and then put them into a more condensed form that makes more sense that you can memorize, like, start to move towards your outline.
Yeah.
The idea that you would just go and retype those same notes that you just took is totally pointless.
Yeah. Yeah. Evernote. That could be really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of programs now. I think people use like the Microsoft One product or whatever that is. OneNote. And whatever you use this. What's it?
Evernote.
Yeah, I was like totally blanking.
I was like, we were just talking about it.
I was like, ever something.
But it's life-changing. I use Evernote to organize my taxes. And this is what made me think about it because it's tax season. And we've been complaining about how neither of us have finished our taxes. And every time I get a tax document, I just like, you can just take your camera and like, take a picture of it and then it turns it into a PDF and then you label it and then it's like all organized. And so you don't have a stack of paper and you're not worried about losing things. It's magic. You need to print it. You just print. It's beautiful. So maybe you can use something like Evernote. Yeah,
I think that's a good idea. I think you should want to think about how you're going to use this material later and make it easy for yourself to do that.
And then you can organize your taxes that way too. It's really been life-changing. All right. What about handling distractions in class?
Well, this is a big one.
This is a big one because we all have a lot of distractions.
Yeah, I mean, I think the introduction of smartphones definitely exponentially increased the level of distraction in most classes, and also Wi-Fi, frankly.
Yeah.
Before then, even if you had your laptop, you basically had just your laptop. It was pretty boring. Now you have the entire universe at your fingertips. It can be hard to sit and focus when your professor is talking about foxes. But again, like, you are in class for a reason. So I think, putting away your phone, maybe even turn it into airplane mode, and maybe even, turn off your Wi-Fi, at least consider it, or at least turn off, your Slack channels or, whatever it is.
Notifications.
Yeah, your notifications, so that you're not really getting distracted, because if you're sitting in class distracted, there's really no point.
Yeah, I mean, I left my phone somewhere yesterday when you and I were out meeting, and I had such a pleasant lunchtime because my phone was not with me for like 90 minutes. And you know what? I made it a whole 90 minutes without it.
I know. I was panicking on your behalf. I was like, oh my gosh, Lee doesn't have her phone. And we're like, well, she has her computer and we're at lunch, so it'll be okay.
And you're one of the people I talked to all day.
Yes. Although it was funny when you needed to call the place that had it and you looked at me and I'm like, why is she looking at me? Like, oh, because she doesn't have her phone, so she has to use mine.
Exactly. But it's often refreshing to remind yourself that it's okay to not be connected to the entire world if you're supposed to be focused on something else.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, this is basic, but I think you want to choose your seat wisely. So even if you are not going to be tempted by these distractions, I pretty much assume other people will be. So it can be very distracting if you're sitting in the back of a class and you've got all these people doing 18 different things in front of you and you're looking at what shoes they're about to buy.
Yeah.
And you're not paying attention to the boxes.
Yeah. I think being prepared for class is really important too. You not only want to kind of do those briefs, the book briefs or the paper briefs, but you also want to have questions. You want to have engaged with the material enough to be interested in what some of those answers might be. And so I think we oftentimes on our briefs recommend that you have a space for questions that you're bringing to class, because you may find they get answered, but if you don't, then you're ready with questions to present to the professor. And then that goes back all the way to the beginning when we talked about participation points.
Right. If you're raising interesting questions that have not been addressed, your professor might actually appreciate that.
Then you're participating. So I think that engaging with the content is going to make class, more fun if you have a clue what's going on. And I think you got to get into the right mindset. Maybe try not to be running from thing to thing to thing to thing and then running frantic into class,
showing up a little bit late or something like that, like we all do it. But it is definitely going to be less stressful if you get there a couple of minutes early, you settle in. I've took a Reiki class, maybe you do your little Reiki while you're sitting there, focus your mind. I'm telling you, it works. It's amazing.
I know.
Yeah, but, even just like having that moment to yourself to kind of take a deep breath and get your notes ready is going to be better than just running around frantically trying to get there at the last second.
And I think this idea to keep in mind, again, is that, we don't function well with tons of distractions. Right. We don't multitask. We try. I try.
We all try.
We all try. And we're terrible at it. And so just remembering that people did used to function. I explained this to my son the other day, that we didn't used to have phones and that came with us. He was like, well, then what did you do?
How did you talk
to people? He's like, well, you just called them. I was like, well, I didn't have a phone, and he was just like, well, what?
I was like, I had to be sitting in my house connected to a cable.
I know.
They had to answer at that moment because we didn't even have voicemail.
I mean, you remember dating when it was like, I wonder if he called and left me a voicemail message on my machine. Like how different that was. I mean, to really feel like a dinosaur. But the reality is it's okay, just like it was okay to not have my phone for 90 minutes at lunch. It's okay to turn off your phone for an hour or put it in your bag. And it can actually be very refreshing. There are some really interesting articles out there, and there's a new book. Who wrote the book about the digital?
Oh, Cal Newport.
We haven't read it yet.
No, but it's digital distractions or something.
But I think this idea of figuring out how to contain your digital existence so you can focus is something that will help you in class, but it's got to help you when you're studying too. You need to be able to put that stuff down, because if you're getting a Slack message and an email message and a text message and you're trying to memorize community property or evidence and you're constantly being interrupted, you're not getting anything done.
No, and I think your professor, too, in class will appreciate it, having a person who's actually focused on what they're talking about and paying attention versus trying to do 17 things at once on their computer or their phone. I mean, the professor sees that. So, if you go to office hours and they see that, like, oh, Lee is always sitting in the front row, like, focused on what I'm talking about, seems to be understanding me, they're going to like you more.
Yeah.
And that's always valuable. I mean, if it doesn't help your grade, it might help you get a recommendation, or they might decide they want you to be their research assistant. So it's worth, being a good class participant.
And like most things in life, if you've developed some bad habits, tomorrow's a new day.
Baby steps.
Try
to get there 5 minutes early, put your phone away. Right. Like, you can always improve.
Exactly. All right. Any final thoughts on making the most of class?
Well, I think it's just a great opportunity. And the reality is, I mean, for me at least, I always thought I am paying a lot of money to be here, and I want to get out of this what I can.
Yeah. And I think if you're from just a practical perspective, it's way more efficient to pay attention in class and learn from the professor than try and teach it to yourself.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, if you enjoyed this episode of the Law School Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review or rating on your favorite listening app, because we'd really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to Lee or Allison at lee@lawschooltoolbox.com or allison@lawschooltoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our website contact form at lawschooltoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.